Hi everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Low Season Traveller Insider Guides. I'm your host, Ged Brown, founder of Low Season Traveller, and this episode is taken from the 11th session of the Keeping the Dream Alive series of webinars, which we're collaborating on with the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage and My Travel Research. This episode is entitled The Big Opportunity for Tourism, and I had the honour of presenting my keynote to the audience of over 500 leaders from the global travel industry as I asked the question, just how truthful has our industry been? Have a listen, let us know what you think. Enjoy. And on that note, Carolyn, are you there?
Yes, I am, Jed. Sorry for the slight delay. I was lost in that forest. I love that poem too. Quite a lot of questions and comments, Jed. So I'm just going to run through. Firstly, Gina says Kia ora from New Zealand.
Oh, hey, Kia ora.
So some other comments in response to your how are you doing? So people say mine's been overwhelming. My lockdown has been juggling a master's degree, no certainty about the future. I'd made the comment, I've never worked as hard before, but never had so many important conversations. And Apolline agrees with me. She said, same here, never worked as much before, never had as many great contacts as during that. Lots of people want to use your daughter's home office, so I think she could actually rent it out. I think it's
surreal.
I think it could be the new trend in offices.
Yeah.
And I'm now going to share my own moment of this because I'm not sure if you can see, but we are actually sharing this. We do have an extra speaker here sat on my lap. So somebody suggested rather than recovery, maybe we went for rebirth.
Yeah, rebirth. I like that.
Term. Yes, and we're demonstrating why you never work with children and animals because they wander off. Then we did get to a question around this issue of the problem of over-tourism and those numbers. It talks about the decentralization of tourism. And this was, you look at Machu Picchu, governments limit the number, but the tour numbers ignore those controls. What do we do, I think, about the ignoring of that control? So I've got lots more questions and comments, but I wondered if we actually wanted to address this issue of the fragmentation of the industry.
Yeah, I think first and foremost we need to understand what the limits are. I find it intriguing. I was speaking to who was it? It was in Brussels. They've started doing this in the Brussels Tourism Authority, and they've created an app. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Caroline, if you came across it. They've got an app which monitors. So it's not personal data, but it monitors the movements of people, and it knows who is a Belgian national because they'll be registered to the Belgian network versus who is a foreign, it's registered outside. And this app actually tracks where the locals are versus where the tourists are. And they promote it for tourists who want to interact more with locals. And also if they understand that there's a whole load of tourists in this area of town, then they can, naturally they can choose to, avoid that area of town and go somewhere where there are less tourists and more locals, for example. So there's that kind of technology, I think, is being used more and more. But for me, the overall part is, what is that golden number? How many can you take? If your destination was, and stick with me on this, Carolyn, because I am going somewhere with it. But on the, if your destination was a theme park, look at what theme parks do. Theme parks are incredibly good at what they do. They're really slick. They know how many really can be the optimum number for in that park. And when they reach that number, it stops. They also divert the flows around. So, you go into Universal Studios, there's a big board there, and it shows you the waiting times for the different rides. That's all about tourism dispersal. It's about dispersing people around. Where you see a queue for 3 hours, you're just going to think, right, I'm not going to go there. I'm not sure there is always a queue of 3 hours, by the way. There. I don't know if I trust those things. But that's the intention that they have, is moving people around. They do it really well. We almost need to, gosh, am I going to say this? We need to treat our destinations like a theme park. First of all, what's the capacity on any given day? And then the next step then is, once we know what that number is, the key part, how do we manage that? How do we manage that? Is that linked with access to the destination in terms of air access, in terms of road access, rail access? I don't know. There's brighter minds out there that probably have got more answers for that. But I think the starting block has to be, we have to know what is the optimum number of visitors that our destination can take.
Well, it's interesting because I know, I'm not so familiar with the Belgian one, but I do know Vienna has been an absolute leader in this. And again, they've used a theory that a lot of, I think, the world's leading destinations who are managing this, like Amsterdam, like Copenhagen, which is, we're all residents. It's just how long we're residents for. So they look at us as part of a network.
Temporary resident. I love that.
Yeah, so it's that idea of we've all got connection to this. And they're looking at a way that they can actually use that mobile signal to put up signage, so that, let's say you're walking from the Ring towards the Schönbrunn Palace, and it can literally put up notices to say, there's currently a 2-hour queue, as you say, for Universal Studios, but this attraction's currently got lower numbers, and that they can actually use that, the same kind of thing. But I think when you say it makes you feel afraid to say we're like to work like a theme park, people look at the theme park part of that. I think what we have to remember is that theme parks are just a very contained place. And I think when we look at this idea of place management, that yes, I definitely think we have lessons to learn about, ownership of place, sense of place, and sense of that, what's the experience that's going to work. And also probably some of that springs from, like, you don't actually want your staff being abused for that. So I definitely think, I mean, I've used some measures that are probably not very sophisticated at a smaller level when I'm working with precincts. We can actually look at the amount of space that's there. We can look at who's going to be there on a normal day. We can look at the space of that and say, well, look, what's the throughput that you can manage? But I think the bit that's missing is the enforcement. And I really would probably link that to the comments you made about that being a spotlight. In tourism, we're often really afraid to offend people. And we've confused the idea of being welcoming with feeling like we have to welcome everyone. And I guess that's where I'd see some of that coming into that. So definitely there. Now, this is an interesting follow-on to that, Ged, from John Howell, who's on the call, so you would have heard all the nice things you said about him.
There you go. You owe me £5 for that, John, by the way.
Yes, I particularly probably appreciate it. Thank you from me, from John, because I know it's pretty early in the morning for you guys. Tourism's too long driven by this basic metric of growth. And I think John Koldovsky in his session, and John is also on the line today, talked about this. He said, who really wants 2,000 tourists charging in to spend very little? He brackets, other than a tourism authority CEO who has been charged with hitting the number. So what should be the new metric? How do we measure success for tourism?
Well, I think that's the big question, really, isn't it? How do you measure success for tourism? I think you would measure it on, it would be a couple of measures. We all know it, and it's often talked about, what the guys in Bhutan are doing. So for anybody out there that isn't familiar with it, they measure famously gross national happiness. So everybody in Bhutan fills out a questionnaire, and it's quite a lengthy and it's not just 5 questions or anything. It's quite a lengthy questionnaire which impacts absolutely every part of their lives. And then what they've done is, with that, they measure the gross national happiness and how happy and content everybody is with every aspect of their life. And then using that, they obviously try and balance the number of visitors which they can have. So, it's really carefully managed in Bhutan as to how many visitor arrivals they can welcome, and it's managed from a governmental level. I actually think that's a pretty slick way to do it. I actually think that works pretty well. It's incredibly courageous of those guys to do that, and it would be incredibly courageous for anybody else to do that. I don't think that if it's the right expression, I don't think we've got the balls to do it. I think we're too kind of scared, because we're so used to, lines have to keep going up. If you're the Minister for Tourism, your arrivals have got to go up. If you're at the helm when those arrivals dip, then it's viewed that you're not doing a good enough job. It should be measured by by the community, by the destination itself. We're always very focused on the travellers, and I can understand that. We want to welcome people, and there's a hospitality side of that. But also we have to really, start putting more of a focus on the communities that live in each destination. I don't know how many people in Venice that live in Venice are actually, from Venice that live in Venice. Same in London. I don't know. Are people getting squeezed out? Is that right? Is that the kind of world we want to live in? I don't think it is, and I think that we can do something about it. But we need strong leadership, Carolyn, and I'm slightly hesitating because you always get nervous when you're having a pop at those in power. But yeah, I think we've been let down by our leaders. And actually, I would say in terms of the travel and tourism industry, I think we've been let down. I don't think they've done enough.
Well, I think, and I mean, maybe what we need to do, Ged, is, because as you say, one always a bit nervous about having a pop at people, but I think we can actually shout out for some of the people who are doing some really great work in this area. Now, it's not specifically tourism, but one of the destinations that I've been most impressed with is the work that Amsterdam's done in applying the idea of donut economics, i.e., what's the safe space where we look at economic growth, but we look at our ability to sustain and support that growth. So we don't see it as this, actually, I sometimes advise this clients on this with brand equity as well, which is we don't assume that this is this endless pit we can keep shoveling stuff out of without actually having to put something back in. And they've actually done their city plan, which includes tourism, among other things. And it's entirely built around this principle of that safe and just space. And all of their planning now sits and looks through that lens. We've mentioned, probably other people are getting a bit like, because you mentioned someone else, but the guys over in New Zealand and Tourism Bay of Plenty, very similar thing, that they've actually sat back. They worked with Destination Think, who I'm a huge fan of their work, and they've looked at that and created that space where it's around that community-based consent of what we're willing to share. And that basic principle actually goes to the heart of almost anything. And it shouldn't be, we've got the frameworks are all there. I mean, there's a document that I use in a lot of my culture and heritage consulting that's actually created by the government of Canada. And they talk about those 3 steps, which is understand what you've got, understand what you've shared, and understand what people want to share. And you start looking at that going, you put it down to that, it's not really that hard, is it? Often there's a simplicity to this, but we've actually got to believe that we can change it, and we've got to look at those measures. And some of the things I'm talking to some clients about at the moment, things like looking at what's the lifetime value of a client, because that stops us getting those people who just want to come in, what we used to call them the tick list travelers, and focuses on the guys who are going to come and come back again, or, have some connection to place, do we actually, we've looked at places like Palau, Hawaii, New Zealand, and some of the other Pacific islands all have a pledge. So when you sign to go into those destinations, you actually pledge to be a good visitor. And I think we need to look at some of those things too.
I love that. They do that in Iceland as well. I know they have the Icelandic tourism pledge, which I think is great. But I think you're right. For me, what I'm always sort of trying to do is, I've always been the traveller where if the example I always tell people, actually, when you talk about New Zealand, myself and Sarah went to New Zealand, back in 2000, my one and only time in New Zealand, and we knew that we had 2 weeks to quote unquote do New Zealand, which is impossible. So people were sort of saying to us, locals were saying, look, you can either race around both islands, really quickly, and you're not going to get much of a chance to take it in, or with 2 weeks, you're probably better off just choosing one island and really, getting under the skin of it as best you can in 2 weeks. So we figured, okay, that's the way to go. And they said, well, look, everybody goes to the South. You've got to go to the South Island. South Island is dramatic. It's beautiful. It's everything else. Everyone goes to the South Island. You've got to. It's a must. It was like a red rag to a bull, Carolyn. I was like, okay. I looked at Sarah and she was the same. She was like, North Island. I was like, yeah, absolutely, North Island. We're the kind of people who, we go for the underdog. If everybody's going to that particular site, we will literally turn around and go in the opposite direction. We want to get something different. And the irony was, as we travelled around these wonderful destinations in the North Island, Napier and all these kind of places, which are wonderful. And we tell people, and they say, oh, you're over from the UK, okay. You're going down to the South Island. We said, no, we're just spending 2 weeks here on the North Island. Oh, fair play to you, mate. They were really appreciative of the fact that we weren't bothering with the South Island. I am, by the way, gutted that I haven't seen the South Island in New Zealand, because I do believe it is absolutely breathtaking. But I'm hoping that one day I will get there. But I that's the kind of ethos that I'm trying to tap into, is people who actually want to go against the flow. And that's what I'm trying to encourage. And that's what I want. If every destination was to start to encourage people that are against the flow, there's always going to be people that are going to want to go to the South Island. And there will be. And I understand that we've got to market it. But I try and tap into the people that have got that psyche of, I want to do something actually, different, whether it be at a different time of the year or a different destination.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that I was really enjoying your analysis of the kind of the fares to Rome, because I actually went to Rome at exactly your low season time. And well, firstly, it's actually pretty spectacularly warm in December.
Yeah, it can be quite mild, actually. Yeah.
But secondly, I think everyone talks about the cost of things, and I think that's maybe an opportunity, because people are going to have to look at their budgets a bit more carefully now.
For sure.
So I think if we're actually saying to people, well, what are you traveling for? And I always laugh at this idea, this question that comes up all the time, and you may even have been asked this yourself, Ged, which is are you a traveler or are you a tourist? To me, it's almost like if you're a traveler, you're not measuring success of, I have to be there when it's bright and sunny or whatever. Similarly, I think, so, and the other thing is some of these destinations are year-round. I suspect the problem is in Venice, that there's actually no such thing as a good time to be in Venice to get away from the crisis.
But do you know what's interesting is I've never been to Venice, Carolyn, and honestly, from all that I've heard, and I've spoken to people about it, genuinely, for the experience that I would like to have in Venice, I think I've missed the opportunity. I've written it off now. I'm not interested in going to Venice, because genuinely, for the experience I would like to have, I've missed the boat on that. It's not going to happen for me. It's kind of ruined. So I don't aspire to go to Venice. I have been to Trieste, which is an hour away from Venice, and it's breathtaking. And comparatively speaking, there's hardly any tourism. And I'm walking around Trieste, which is actually the heart of, the home of coffee, although they don't grow any, obviously. But they have wonderful coffee and a cafe culture. And I'm walking around all this incredible architecture and squares that are, all right, not quite as big as St. Peter's Square, but breathtaking. And I'm just thinking, well, where's all the tourists? There's nobody here. And I'm laughing to myself. I've got the whole place to myself. I was there it was in February. Clear skies, sun was shining, it was cold. There was as they call it, the border, the wind which comes in. Utterly wonderful. Talk about engaging with the local population. I mean, there wasn't anybody that wasn't local there, and it's less than an hour from all of those major airports in Venice. I'm just thinking, this is insane. Why aren't we doing more to promote these kind of destinations at these times of the year? Because the experience is wonderful. We need to be unashamed of that, and we need to knock the fear out. And I think a lot of it is people have a fear. What's it going to be like in Thailand if I go during the rainy season, or in Kenya during the rainy season? What's it going to be like? Is it going to be ruined? Am I going to be rained out? We all know that in most, or an awful lot of the rainy seasons, whether it be the Caribbean or, Southeast Asia, it doesn't rain all day, every day. And actually, sometimes it can add a little bit more reality to the tropics, which is where you are. It's meant to rain in the tropics. What are you going for this destination for? You just want to lie on a beach all day? Well, frankly, yeah, go in the summer season, pay 5 times the price, and do that. But don't go to these destinations if that's all you want to do. That sounds probably quite snobby. I don't mean it to sound snobby, but that's genuinely how I feel about it.
Well, I'm probably a bit more mixed on this, because I was actually due to be leaving Venice today, but I was traveling for an event. Yes, I was supposed to be rowing in, but an event that would enable us to connect with locals, which is they have a big rowing race called the Vogalonga, which is basically to row around the canals of Venice. And apparently it's for one of those things where that hasn't lost that connection to place. But it actually, the second part of my trip was then to go on to the Dolomites. And one of my big challenges was, and I think this is where we need to shift the supply side of this, is it's actually really hard to go walking in the Dolomites in the first part of June, because none of the buses, for example, none of the local buses run beyond the immediate essential ones to get kids to school until the middle of June. So for me, traveling as a low season traveler, I was expecting to have to do a lot of very long walks in and out on roads or hire Ubers. So, and I know that that's been a problem, here in Australia, Tasmania. Traditionally, if you wanted to go to Tasmania out of season, it was pretty tough because most things closed down. Now, Stu Spears, who's also on the line, who talked in our events, talked about how Dark Mofo started to change that. But I think that's the other thing is, that how do we get people to balance that demand and realize that there will be things to do, and it is worth opening for visitors at that time.
It's a really hard one. It is that classic chicken and egg, isn't it? But when you look at Tasmania, my first point would be, I don't know a huge amount about Tasmania. I confess I'm completely ignorant to it. I've heard it's a wonderful spot, but really, people of Tasmania, is your destination? Is it special? Is it worth visiting in the winter months or whenever is the low season months? And if so, what is it that's great about that? Because I just believe that there are, it's that a cliche, Carolyn. There is beauty absolutely everywhere if you look for it. And sometimes we don't appreciate what's on our doorstep. So I'm the first to say, I often say, look, I'm here north of Manchester. I'm speaking to you guys in Sydney, and I'm like, oh man, why don't I live in Sydney? And I'll speak to somebody else who's based in Mallorca, and I'm like, oh great, why do I live here? And then I go out for a walk, and I always moan, by the way, the fact we haven't got a garden. We've got the tiniest little square yard where the girls sunbathe underneath the washing that's hanging out above them because there isn't space. And we walk 10 minutes down the road, and we're in the most breathtaking countryside. And even in the winter, there's a place called Hollingworth Lake near us, and it's utterly wonderful. You walk around the lake, and it's about sort of 3-4K. And it's absolutely gorgeous, rolling green hills. And on a day like today, it's sunny and it's nice. But even in the winter, there's a certain bleakness to it where you're up on the moors near the Pennines there. And it's great. And part of me thinks, I'm taking this for granted. But actually, there are people in the world that would absolutely love to visit where I live. And I'm starting to recognize that more and more. And I think we all need to recognize our own destinations and what's great about those destinations at different times of the year, because I think we just take it for granted.
I think we do. Now, a quick question. No doubt he'll be delighted for the shout out as well. Mohammed Shokavand is on the call, and he's going, how can we increase the value of tourism during low seasons as we miss it mostly during high seasons? So I delved a bit further into that, Ged, to make sure we understood what that question was. So he's saying most tourists get engaged with attractions rather than getting deep into the cultural values of the destinations because it's crowded, because of the infrastructure and the time-related issues of destinations. So how do we get people to understand that, the value of getting under the skin a bit more?
I think it's probably a better one for someone like you, Carolyn, almost. It's a marketing question, no? It's about positioning, and it's about how we communicate. And we have to try and understand, again, travel during the low seasons, ridiculous though it is, really, it hasn't been done before in terms of the industry getting together in any kind of a unified way to promote proudly our low seasons. It hasn't really been done before. Stu Spears said it best. We've kind of, each destination has on their own tried to create events to try and boost their particular sides, but as an industry we haven't really tried to tackle it. So I think we need to do more research. You'll be glad to know, Carolyn, you'd have to be involved on it. Hopefully there'll be cash for you somewhere on this, but we need to do more research on these people that do travel during the low seasons. What are their personality profiles? What kind of people are they? I'm pretty confident that they're growing in number, but we need to start to substantiate this, and find out where are they and how do we communicate best to them. And the irony is, and I'm the first to say, I'm trying to talk about, we've got an opportunity now where peak seasons, if you're looking at Europe, large parts of southern and northern Europe, the peak seasons are the summer months for a variety of reasons. That is going to be decimated So we do need to promote the lower seasons, but it's probably not going to be the same people. I don't necessarily think that somebody who travels during the peak season is somebody who is always going to travel during the low season as well. There'll be exceptions, so people that will travel maybe twice in a year or 3 times in a year, where they will go, because of the kids' holidays, they'll go with the kids during the summer months, but then they can also travel during low season months when they don't need to go with the kids for the kids' holiday. But what are the traveler profiles of people that travel typically during a peak season versus during a low season? I don't know. I can probably have a guess and a feel for it, but as you always very rightly point out, Caroline, you need evidence on this. It's not good enough just to have a hunch.
Well, there is actually quite a lot of evidence out, not across the industry, Ged. I think we've never looked at it as that specific lens, but it wouldn't actually be that hard to do. But for example, Adventure Travel Trade Association, ATA, has looked at this for who takes adventure holidays out of season. And they see 2 specific audiences, which is one which skews older affluent. And the other is, again, quite often solo or group female travelers will travel then. Again, all sorts of cultural reasons for determining that. So that's definitely 2 audiences that I know when I'm encouraging people to say, look, if you are trying to build that year-round profile, definitely be thinking about that. And my former business partner, Bronwyn White, that older demographic is definitely hers. And she said they are absolutely your #1 audience, because no ties, no having to worry about taking the kids out of school or agony around this. Quite often very good levels of high disposable income. I mean, there's societal problems with the degree to which we have intergenerational inequalities, but definitely if you're a tourism destination, there's there. And the interesting thing about that is they're almost completely invisible in most tourism marketing. We talk about the key demographics of being 18 to 53-year-olds, 18 to 54-year-olds, and they're completely invisible, or they're presented in very stereotypical ways. So they're definitely audiences. The other one, I think, is think about where, that habitual behavior that you talked about of people traveling at certain times of year, and we know that that's absolutely hardwired in. Targeting those markets, if it's your out of season when it's their in season, can actually be a really great thing to do. So quite a lot of, it may be a surprise to some people around the world, but there are bits of Australia where it does get cold. And not just Melbourne, sorry, that's a Sydney joke. But if you look at pretty much the southern part of New South Wales, most of Victoria in winter, places like South Australia and Kangaroo Island, it gets pretty cold. We've actually got snow on our mountains at the moment. We're looking forward to a good ski season. And the people, I was in Kangaroo Island last August for an industry workshop, and the place was full of Italians, because it's impossible to get Italians to understand that you travel outside peak seasons. Behaviorally, it's very rare, but they don't care if it's cold where they go. They know it's going to be cold in Australia, but they travel in July and August. So if you're looking to do that, those hotels were full of international tourists, simply because it was looking at that habitual behavior in a different way. And I think that it's a great example of thinking about who's coming at that time of year.
I love that. I think that's definitely a way that you can it can work to your favor if you've got markets like that, like with the Italian market. And I think as well, you've got destinations, since I started down this road, initially, a year and a half or whatever, when I came up with this on the low season traveler side, people were saying to me, well, you're obviously not including anything to do with families then, because school holidays are peak season, so obviously that's not your market. And initially I was thinking, okay, I'll take the sort of the over 50s whose kids have flown the nest and the under 30s who haven't got kids yet. That's a big enough market to go at. I'm not worried by that. But then as I got under the skin of this, there's just so many destinations that have got their low seasons during school holidays, and it's not awful, it's not scary, it's not bad. People talk about it in a bad way. Not the right example, but I just wanted to bear with me on this for the comparison. Las Vegas in July and August is hotter than hell.
Yes.
Let me tell you, they do a roaring trade. People are not put off. The Brits, they'll go there, no problem whatsoever. There's flights from Manchester, or there was until recently, London, you name it. They'll go to Las Vegas. Would they go and stay in Dubai? Oh, you're crazy. It's the desert. Yeah, do you know the heat in Dubai in the summer? Yeah, it's not that much hotter than Las Vegas, but you go to Las Vegas. It's about perception. There's a fear. When you do go to Dubai in July and August, it is hotter than hell, but they have temperature controlled pools. You can still have a fair experience. And by the way, you're paying a fraction of the price as well. Is it utterly awful and you'll wish you never went? No. Frankly, it's not. The same with Madrid. People talk about not going to Madrid in August, which is, by the way, the low season. You can get great deals Madrid in August if you want a weekend break. Sun's shining, and it is hot. Well, it's not hotter than the sun. Let's get things in perspective here. You're talking about, between 30 and 35 degrees. Maybe it might get up to 36, 37 degrees. But can you still enjoy everything that Madrid has to offer? Is it all still open? Yeah, absolutely. Is it the kids' school holidays? Yeah, absolutely. Would the kids have a good time? Yeah, absolutely. We need to understand that. One more example, Antigua. Antigua, wonderful destination. Caribbean destination, as we all know. Antigua's low season, June, July, early August. Low season. Why? It tends to have more rain, but anybody that knows Antigua, again, if you look at those rainfall charts, and we were dreadful in the travel industry at this, Carolyn, because as a travel agent, we always used to do it. They used to say, we're thinking about going to Antigua, what's the weather like? And we'd go to the rainfall chart straight away. And you see that bell-shaped curve yet again, and the peak was in June and July, and they were like, oh, I'm not going then. It's like ridiculous. The reality is, in June and July, for about 2, maybe 3 hours a day, usually in the evenings, it rains like you have never seen rain in your life before. But for the rest of the time, it's actually quite dry, and it's quite a wonderful occasion. And when that rain comes down in the afternoon, when you've been on the beach, and it starts to come down, and you rush to the side of the beach where there's inevitably some kind of a thatched beach bar, and you hunker in there for 2 or 3 hours as it starts to get dark and the rain's pouring, and while you're in there, you're drinking cocktails and you're thinking, you know what, I'm not even going outside again until this rain stops. But you're all in there together. Whoever's in that bar, once that rain starts, you're all in there together, and you've got a common bond. You're all in there until the rain stops, because no way is anybody going out there in that. And then when the rain stops, you do dissipate. But what a wonderful experience. Is that a worse experience than the peak time when it's dry? Absolutely not. In my opinion, it's a much better experience. Is it during the summer holidays when the kids are off? Yeah, it is actually. But how many people know about it? We have a fear, and we need to overcome the fear. And that's through communicating and educating people.
And also it's about, one big audience for Outback Australia, for example, who comes, it's like Dubai, or it is hot. I have to tell you, it will go down to 40 degrees at midnight. But the German backpackers or long-term drive market, they adore it. They'll actually complain if it gets down to 35 degrees, because that's not what they came for. Yes.
My God.
And they are the savior of regional areas in what is their low season. Or another great example of that, again, Stu's stuff, you may remember he referenced something called the Parks Elvis Festival. Again, it's typically 38, 40 degrees in Parks, but the festival is so cool. It's like, wall to wall Elvises. I must admit, some of them are hot and bothered. So I can definitely recommend that.
That's absolutely on my list.
You have to go. It's January the 7th. It's around the time of Elvis's birthday. But you need to give 2 years. It'll take you 2 years to get in to book.
Really?
Unless you're prepared to truck in 40, 50 kilometers to do it.
Wow.
So a good question, picking up on this issue of small businesses versus large businesses from Sean. Ged. Agree on your point with small business having the ability to drive change. The challenge is the big ones have the capital to buy out the smaller ones, and then, or just capture the market and beat them on price with the same or similar quality. Is there a way for smaller businesses to work together to collaborate? And if so, what are the networks or frameworks that we can use to do that?
Look, my take on that is, look, can small businesses collaborate? Yes. I think the biggest danger is, and this is just what I've sort of noticed myself really as much as anything, is as small businesses, we're fighting so hard to get any business that we can, that is parochial the right word? We kind of just want to look out for ourselves. We tend not to be quite as giving to others because we want to make sure that we're getting it back. And if they're not going to give it back to me, and we're kind of not mistrustful, but I think we need to be a little bit more open. And that was my point with about really trying hard and making a concerted effort to be a spotlight. I'm trying since the lockdown especially to shine a light on other businesses, because I know intrinsically what it's like myself. So if I can shine a light on any other businesses, if I can connect people, anything I can do, because I believe that the smaller guys do need to stick together and they do need to help each other out. And I will absolutely play my role. And I'm just going to have to hope and trust that the other parties will do exactly the same. But it falls down pretty quickly if people don't play the game. You always sort of see it where I see it occasionally on Facebook. I'm sure you've all seen this, where it's like, hey, we should all like each other's page. There's 40,000 of us on here, and if we all do this right, then we're all going to get 40,000 visitors. And whoever wrote that post, by the way, gets the lion's share of all of the likes that are there to be had. But the rest further down the list don't. And that's where it's kind of tough. But I think that look, the starting point for small businesses is they're led by individuals who deeply care, first and foremost. They care because they love the travel industry, they love the planet, they love the earth that we live in, and they love society. But also they care because it's their business, and it's up to them whether they make that a success or not. And that's why Ray Bloom, in whatever age he is, will be stood outside IMEX shaking everybody's hands. Probably not shaking hands anymore, by the way, due to coronavirus. But,
probably a bit of elbow bumping.
Probably a bit of elbow bumping. But that's why he does that, because it's his business, and no one cares more about that business than he does, because he's the owner. So that's natural. But he cares because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to show his appreciation. Does that happen and I'm not picking on them, but they're not on the call, so it doesn't matter anyway. But those big Roots events where I used to work, does the event director stand at the exit, and would they shake the hands of everybody there and thank everybody personally? No, not really, because they're getting paid either way, and it doesn't really matter. It's just a big company. They don't care to that degree, and they make their decisions in the same way, Carolyn. And that's what frightened me. I've worked for the big companies, and profits absolutely come first. You have to deliver for those shareholders, and it has to be increased profits. And if that means, even though, and I've been in the meetings, we all know around that table, this isn't the right thing to do. This feels very, very wrong. But ultimately, whoever the event director is, or the head of that particular organization, they'll say, nope, that's the way it has to be. And that's because if they hit the targets, they get their bonus as well. Everybody's just kind of, it just falls down. And that's why the future, if we're going to have a really good, sustainable future for the global travel industry, it has to be us as the small guys. We need to, in answer to the question, we need to learn and find a way to work together better. Because if we don't, the big guys sure as hell aren't going to do it. It's just going to go back down the road that we were at. The numbers just need to keep going up. And as long as the number goes up, those kind of the bean counters are happy. And unfortunately, the rest of the world is not going to benefit from that. And it's going to harm the communities that we serve.
I will just do, again, you did a shout out for Greg and Colin, the crazy Canucks. I know.
Yeah.
And I do encourage you to tune in, because when they interview you, because I seriously do make sure you've got lots of your. I'm trying to think what the equivalent of Canadiana is for the UK, but I would drape the places in Union Jacks and top hats and whatever. Because believe me, you'll never see so much Canadiana. I was feeling a little bit bare. I'd left all my koalas elsewhere. But they're actually building, and similarly, Suzanne Kavanagh from Creative Planet down here in Australia, they're actually building these connections of local communities where they're creating the frameworks to do this. And they had a post in LinkedIn today about the work that they're doing, where businesses in Nicola Valley have come together and created that local association. And there is that, the reciprocity is built into doing some of that stuff. But even for big businesses, I do want to do a bit of a shout out to some businesses who I think got big by doing the right thing. You look at some of, again, the Intrepid Travels and the G Adventures of this world, they got big by doing the right thing. And if we look across at sectors like Patagonia, so Patagonia has basically, it's dealt with the issue of waste in its areas of, they've got circular fashion. You buy your Patagonia jacket, when it wears out, you take it back and they dispose it. So, you know, there are companies who are proving that the old model doesn't work. And when I read from McKinsey's saying that, you know, those models aren't going to work anymore and we need to frame it, I know that we do have this time has made us sit and think about how we get through. So I do think there are some examples
Yeah,
there.
good point. Good point.
We do have some requests, Ged, whether people can use the slides or share your slides with other people. I presume
absolutely, absolutely. No problem whatsoever. We'll get those put online after the call. No issue.
Okay. And a question from Kevin. So low season promotions can enhance many destinations. Cooperation of airlines is essential. If not as many airlines survive COVID-19, what might be the result? Will low season prices be substantially closer to shoulder and high season questions? Oh, that's a bit of a curly one, Kevin.
Yeah, you know, Kevin, I sincerely hope so, because for me, I don't think that the biggest plus point for the low seasons is the price. For me, the whole issue of traveling during the low seasons, the benefits of traveling during the low season, is that it's less crowded, more local interaction, better use of your time, experiencing something new. You know, you can go to an old destination that many people have gone to, but you're having a completely different experience during the low seasons, and that to me is the stuff that's powerful. The half price element of the example that I gave, that to me is that's inconsequential actually, because you know I don't just want to. I mean, I want to save money, and I think that's important, but actually, you know, I really do think that the tourism offering during the low seasons is every bit as valuable as it is during the peak seasons, but it's supply and demand. So I think, you know, in answer to your question, if demand sufficiently increases for the low seasons, then prices will rise. Yeah, and actually, you know, great. Good. That's good for you. It's good for me. It's good for everybody in the industry, and as well because it starts to flatten it out. And the more people that travel during the low seasons, the more people will talk about these great experiences that they've had, and more people will aspire to travel during the low seasons. And then you will start to flatten out the seasonality, and that is only going to be a good thing for everybody.
Okay, now I'm going to say this is a real compliment to your presentation. We're getting some really curly questions coming through now, Ged.
Okay.
So one from Judy. There are sites with seasonal preference due to religious holidays.
Yep.
How do we handle high numbers to those with religious preference? And I remember being in India, to take Judy's point, a few years ago, where they were talking about, you know, there are sites in India where when we talk about seasonality, there's a 5-day period when 4 million people visit, and then no one comes the rest of the year.
I think there's. I mean, look, there's not a huge amount that you can do about that.
No.
Really, if it's religious reasons, you know, if you're talking about, you know, the Hajj or whatever, you know, what can you do about that? I think all that you can kind of do is, you know, you can still encourage people to experience what everybody else experiences at different times of the year if they're not from that religion, because, you know, the time of the year isn't as important to them. So you've still got an opportunity to grow, and that's the whole point with this. You know, you talk about, you know, the beach there in Salou was pretty horrendous, Levant Beach, during the peak season. But here's the thing: is if that destination can conceivably cope with, I don't know, 10 million visitors during those key 3 or 4 months, and it can actually cope, and, you know, the community still benefit and nothing is taken away from it, then here's the deal: if you promote the low seasons, actually, you know, you can welcome more visitors. So I think the whole point that I'm trying to say is, you know, as an industry, I'm not saying tourism growth is bad. You know, despite the fact that what it might sound like, I'm not saying that relentless march to 2030 and, you know, whatever it is, 2 billion international arrivals, I'm not necessarily saying that that's bad. I actually think that as a world we can take a lot more tourists. I just think it's about how we spread them around, and that's the problem. So what I'm trying to say is, if we do want to keep seeing tourism growth around the world, and we all want to benefit from that, then, you know, the only way that we can do that in a sustainable, realistic manner is by spreading out the seasonality. There is no other option. You can't just keep funneling it into the same places at the same time of the year and developing new places to be deeply seasonal as well. That's not sustainable. Building new hotels and new resorts on a new island in the Caribbean, that's not right, is it? Because then those same resorts are going to be 20% occupied for 6 months of the year. How's that sustainable? Is that the best use out of those resources? Of course it's not. This is childlike in its simplicity, utterly childlike. I envisage this. Forgive me on this, Carolyn, but the way, and I was looking for a graphic to show this, because the way in which I envisage it is if you can all imagine 12 transparent cans of baked beans. Okay, baked bean cans was how I was envisaging this. I was envisaging the tourist as beans, baked beans, if you will. And I was imagining that in the middle there for June, July, and August, you've got beans overflowing out of the top, and you've got a dribble of beans in the rest. And what we're trying to say is we need to get more tourism in, those same cans. And even a kid would say, well, just fill the other cans. Like, what are you doing? And that's just it. It's childlike in its simplicity. Yeah. But we need to make a conscious effort to it. We need to actually promote it. And we need to put a focus on promoting those low seasons and, be unashamed to do so. I want to put more of a focus on low season than travel the rest of the time, because we need to rebalance it. One of the things I equate it to, again, if you'll sort of forgive the parallel, but actually it's in terms of sexism, in terms of the roles of women. I've got friends that have sort of said, oh, we do too much to pander to women. And it's like, no, we have to rebalance things first. We can't treat everybody the same, because some people said to me, oh, you need to treat everybody just the same. Forget about that. But it's like, no, we need to have more representation of women until things are balanced. So actually, we do need to focus more on women around the world. And then once we've got that balance, then absolutely we'll treat everybody the same. Absolutely, level it out. But at the moment, it's not a level playing field. And until it is a level playing field, we have to put that focus there. And that's the same with the low seasons. Forgive the slight parallel.
No, I think both of those things, one of the things I suspect you get, Ged, and this is a question from me, because I get the same thing when we talk about this issue with women, is people will start giving you all this rationalization. So for example, I attend an annual digital conference, and they had this a whole area where there was not one woman business that was featured, and they said, oh, well, no one put their hand up. And I'm like, well, that's the rationalization. That's not the answer. It's sending the wrong message. So do you get that with low season when you talk to people start explaining to you all the reasons they can't rather than all the reasons they can, without thinking about it?
I find it fascinating because, again, this is, you're right, Caroline, this is all very much linked with psychology. Huge amounts of this is all about psychology. And the nearest answer I'll give you to that is when I used to work at, well, it was at Roots, actually. So I used to sit on the senior management team. And if you'd have an idea for the business in general, you'd say, look, I want to put this out there. I've got this idea. What do you think about if we did X, Y, and Z? And what happens around the room, you get different people that will basically start listing immediately why it won't work, why it's a bad idea, and everything else. So I used to change the question. I used to frame the question of, look, if we were going to do X, Y, and Z, how would we make that work? That's my question. How would we make it work? Just to get them more focused on, the solutions rather than knocking it. But our human instinct seems to be always to find problems. And I get it all the time. People like, it won't work because of this. And then you'll knock that one on the head. And then now it won't work because of this. And I'm like, Jesus, just try and see the solutions first. Is it the right thing to do? First of all, that's the starting point. Is it right to promote tourism during the low seasons to flatten the curve? If our answer to that is a unanimous yes, then let's figure it out. We're all smart people. Let's figure it out. Let's not come up with the problems as to why it won't work. There's probably a million reasons why it won't work, but there's also actually quite a lot of reasons why it will work and why we can make it work. And that's the frame of mind. So it's that sort of positioning, Carolyn. I think you're right. You have to position the question.
I think that's a little bit what Tammy was talking about in her thing on innovation, is the way that we frame those questions and debates. I think so. Now, this is, I think it's a little bit left field from the out of season, but it is an interesting one that I think that the answer would actually be helpful for thinking about some of that. So this is Inigo, and he's working on a project which is an interregional European project about Napoleonic heritage in Spain and Portugal. He's going, how do we involve, which a perfect one for a WeTAC webinar after all. My question is how to involve local communities in this kind of projects.
Wow. Well, I think first of all, you know, does the local community, you know, do they care? Is this inexplicably linked with the pride they have for their destination? Because frankly, if they don't care, maybe it's because they're unaware. Maybe there's an educational piece within the local community. So you know, I think what it comes down to is how are you engaging with the local community? Are they receptive to this? That's the kind of, you know, the kind of stuff that you need to answer. What do you think, Carolyn?
Well, because I do quite a lot of community consultations in projects, and in fact, I now get to the point where I really don't want to work on a project if that's not built in. I mean, the first thing is to find out what are your networks of influence in that community. So who can get you in the door in the first place? And there's no substitute in that for literally going out and doing, well, you know, firstly, you can do some desk research, you know, who's talking in local, lots of local communities now have, you know, little Facebook groups, they have all of those things. So who are your networks of influence? And it can be, you know, local chambers of commerce are usually a great one. Local government, you know, talking to the mayor or the economic development office in a lot of these places, that will get you your kind of official ones. And then what are your kind of unofficial ones? You know, what is, you know, the Mums Facebook group or the local historical society, all of those people who can get in. And then you use those and you spread out from there. So I think for me, there's, to be honest, and you go, there's no easy way to do this. You've actually got to put the hard yards in. The concept is easy, the way I've just described it, but then it's that hard yards of going out and using those local networks and doing this. And, you know, I'm a great fan of systems that are conversations. Very often with a lot of these tourism development, there's a lot of we the experts telling you about your destination. So it's really, to me, it's not just how, it's you know, how do we involve them? It's how you actually do that involvement. So it's not just a here's an information session. Many years ago, I worked with a National Parks Authority, and they were doing what they called local community consultation, and none of the locals I spoke to knew anything about it. And they said, oh, but, you know, we have all these processes. And I said, well, you know, how do people find out about it? Do you advertise it on the local rate? And they said, oh, it's invitation only. So, you know, put it out there and make sure it's, you know, make sure that people can see it in the local supermarket when they're queuing up for milk and stuff like that. So I think that that's a really, really important one. So lots of stuff coming through about measurement and lots of ideas about measurement. So Nigel's saying, let me see, health, wealth and well-being of the local community. Somebody's asking, do we have the questionnaire that Bhutan uses? I think if you were to do a Google search on that, Kruti, you might find there's quite a lot of evidence about how that's measured, but there's also, I know this is something the UK government, certainly until quite recently, was looking at. I don't think I'd like to be looking at those measures at the moment. I know the guys at DCI, Olivier Henry and his team do tourism sentiment. There's lots of tourism sentiment trackers out there. So, but lots of questions about coming back to this, how do we measure what success is? Do we feel we've covered that, or is there anything else that we'd like to add on that, Ged?
No, I mean, look, I think you know, I think it's what we sort of said before, really. I think success is if you've got a, you know, if you've got a tourism offering that doesn't negatively impact the community that lives in that destination. And that doesn't, you know, I'm sure Chris would have something to say on this actually, that doesn't destroy the very purpose as to why people want to travel to that destination to begin with. You know, Chris has got countless examples, and I've seen Chris's presentations over the years on this. He's got countless examples where, you know, especially on the cultural heritage side, where the very reason that people would want to travel there is being destroyed by the sheer volume of tourists. So, you know, the number of tourists actually is one very important one to understand, how many is too much and to start to restrict those. But then also, I think as you said before, Carolyn, the local sentiment around this.
And Chris has been pretty quiet, hasn't he?
He's been very quiet, hasn't he? He's been very shy. I'm not sure he's still there. I don't even know if he's still on the line. I think he's gone for a brew.
I know he's switching on. I can see his microphone coming on.
Hey,
sorry, just waking up. Have you finished?
Oh, yeah, hilarious. Yeah, hilarious. Yeah.
What were you talking about? Over tourism and people not having the genuine experience.
So what are the ways that we should measure success for tourism, Chris? And as Jed said, you spent a lot of time talking about this. I'll give you a moment to think about it. Go on.
I would say the first thing that comes to my mind all the time is that community engagement. You can't begin to formulate a matrix with a destination, a town, a city, a country, unless you actually fully understand what the impact is going to be with that local population, with that local community. And as soon as it starts to have a negative impact, then you need to start to change things around. But that whole idea of carrying capacity, I know you spoke about it before, Jed. It baffles me why destinations don't look at this. How much can you take before you break? How many coach bays do you need before you need to reinvest? And it's this reinvest idea that seems to be missing. We'll build something and then we'll get on with something else. But it's a conversation that is continuous. It's a circular conversation because you have to keep looking at how your tourism grows. What are the things that are missing? And it's a whole of government approach. A tourism destination marketing organization, a Tourism New Zealand or Australia or the UK, they're tasked with bringing people to that destination. It's other government departments that are tasked with developing the infrastructure that is going to fit that particular growth. And that's the missing piece of the jigsaw. It's the fact that it's not being looked at as a whole of government approach. So that needs to change. It was interesting when you showed that that graph on Turkey. I think it was the first one you showed on the growth.
Yeah.
I wrote a blog last year when the tourism and the Minister for Tourism and Culture for Turkey made an announcement. And in the same announcement, he said that in 2018, they'd achieved 40 million inbound tourist arrivals, which is pretty good for any destination, really. But in the same breath, he said he wanted to increase that to 70 million by 2023. And how he was going to do that, he was going to open up sensitive areas that are currently out of bounds for tourists. So there will be your archaeological sites, there will be your communities that are sort of off the beaten track a little bit. And you're talking about a 4-year period, or if you want to condense that, it's probably going to be 3 years for what he wants to achieve, this almost doubling of those figures. Do you reckon he's had the conversations with the people, with the institutions, with the various people who are going to be impacted by this? Absolutely not. So this is the other key element that we need to focus on, is leadership, and the fact that most ministers out there will not want to take a dive in numbers on their watch. Instead of aggregating it and making it more equitable over a 12-month period, they see it as a sign of weakness. The fact that we can have a lower visitation number, but the value in terms of dollars is one thing. The value in terms of community is massive. Yet that never seems to be on the agenda. So, not quite sure if I answered the question that you were asking there, but that's the kind of thing that I think about.
I think we've spoken about this before, Chris, with regards to the ministers and your point there, because I used to speak to all of the ministers that used to turn up to World Roots, the ministers for tourism, and it was that realization. And again, this is just for our listeners' point of view, in case they're not aware. But a minister for tourism is not like the most respected person in the tourism industry in any given destination. They were probably looking after health and education before. They're a professional politician who are absolute experts at getting votes. That's what they do, and that's how they exist. They're not, God's answer to, tourism gods. They're there in a political position. They don't usually know anything of any great substance about the global travel and tourism industry, and they certainly don't know about best practice. And it's only by speaking to some of these ministers that you really get a sense on that. Just for again, just for our listeners, just to give you a clear example of this. And I know I've spoke to you before and told you about this, Chris, but when I was at Roots, obviously we were there, promoting air service development for tourism authorities, and I was really interested in finding out, what involvement tourism ministries had in this whole process. So I would speak to a tourism minister and I'd say, look, what are your tourism aspirations for the next 3 years? What's the plan in terms of visitor arrivals for the next I don't know, 3 years, 2 years, whatever? And they'd tell me 10 million, whatever it was. I'd say, great, how many of those are arriving by air and how many by sea and how many by land? I'd say, well, there's going to be, I don't know, 5 million by air in the next 3 years. I'd be like, great, so what are the airlines then that you've got lined up? What are the markets that you're working on that are filling that? You must be in pretty advanced conversations with these airlines then if it's the next 3 years. And they'd be like, well, that's not our business at the tourism. You need to speak to the aviation guys about that. I was saying, well, sorry, you've just told me that the overall master plan is that you're going to have an extra, whatever it was, 5 million tourists in the next 3 years, and so many of those were going to be by air. So if I speak to the airport guys who are having these conversations with the airlines who are responsible for that, they know those figures then, do they? And of course they didn't. There was a complete disconnect. They would say, if you want to talk about air, speak to the airports. If you want to speak to talk about cruising and sea, speak to the port guys. They'll tell you the latest program as to what's coming. Nobody is bringing it all together. And the tourism ministers and governments, they're certainly not helping out on that.
Well, I think when you look at tourism ministers or the life of a tourism minister in Asia Pacific, I think the average life of a tourism minister is probably just over 12 months. So there's no continuity.
Yeah.
And this is another thing. There is no master plan. There is no strategy or long-term thought. I say to you often, Ged, that we live in a KPI mentality these days, where everything is instant coffee, when everything is reliable on my bonus at the end of the year. And if I reach my targets by August or September or whatever it is, fine, I'll sit back and I won't do anything. And that has to change. If one thing that the COVID-19 does, it has to change this KPI mentality that we've been schooled upon, where everything has to happen now. Slow travel is going to become something that I think will become incredibly popular, increasingly popular over the coming years, because this mad rush that we've all been in for years is insane. It really is insane. We're talking about low season experiences. I had an amazing low season experience a couple of years ago. I went to the Northern Territory in the wet season, and everyone goes, "Oh, you're crazy. What are you going in the wet season for? Everything's closed." There is a lot of stuff closed, but you have amazing lightning storms. You can still go on the water in Darwin. You can still do all sorts of different things. And I was one of the lucky 1% of visitors to Uluru, to Ayers Rock as it was known, that got to see it as a waterfall, a series of waterfalls. And that is an incredibly powerful, visual and experience to have when you have these incredible thunderstorms happening over, and the whole thing turns into this giant waterfall. So there are incredible experiences to have all over the world in low season. We just got to embrace it and not be afraid of it, as you say. And this is something that it's all about the messaging, isn't it? It's all about how we communicate this. Maybe now, this is probably a good start point for destinations to start to reconsider what they think is a strategy that's a benefit for all.
Well, it's interesting because we started the move away from, so in Australia for a long time, the measure has not been visitor numbers, but was overnight visitor expenditure. And it's interesting because it's a start, but it's not the whole story. Firstly, because it then doesn't deal with cost. So you never look at, one of the things that drives me bonkers in tourism is we almost never look at cost of acquisition of customers.
Correct.
So we look at we've got this expenditure, but we're like, well, how much did we actually have to spend to get those people? And what are the costs of that? if what are the costs if we're because I think that's one of the problems is the money flows into some pockets, but the costs flow to other people. So we've got all of those externalities, and I think that's where I do see the worries. That it's not that those are bad KPIs in their own right. I certainly, as I say, I think the expenditure measure is a good one, but it still doesn't look at, well, it was always measured almost at a kind of, you'd look at this in interesting ways. And a really good example for me, so, China now is pretty much, or was until COVID-19, Australia's biggest or almost biggest market, certainly biggest in terms of expenditure. But a few years ago, I did some work with Tourism Research Australia with Queensland and Victoria, looking at the value of the domestic accessible tourism market. And then one of the consultants who worked with us, and again, I must give a shout out to Bill Forrester of Travelability, who is absolutely awesome. He overlaid that to bring in the value of the international bit. We actually looked at this and said, already the accessible tourism market in Australia is as big as the market from China.
Well.
And here's the other thing about those markets is people in that market sector are, they're more loyal, much higher repeat visitation. Their per capita spend is pretty good because often they'll be traveling with carers or whatever. So they're actually a really great market, but the whole industry is like, oh, it's too hard. And they have a total compliance mindset around accessible tourism. They do the things they have to do because it's the law. And one great example of this, so I'd have all these hotels saying to me, oh yeah, well, no one ever uses, one of the things I know is it's hard to sell accessible rooms because as a consultant, when someone else is paying, that's usually the room I end up in. But when I was talking, I did a lot of the interview. I had the privilege of talking to people about this, which is one of the great things about my jobs. And I said to people, oh, the hotel industry will, tell me that they can't sell those rooms. And they said, well, have you ever seen a promotion for an accessible hotel room? No, you never have, because everyone had seen it as, well, we've got this thing and somehow we've got to sweat this asset and put it out there. No one had actually gone out and said, we have these amazing accessible rooms, and it's got this and it's got that. But similarly, they also said, you don't even need to sell that. I interviewed someone who said, I don't need a fully accessible room. I just need to know that I can get out of a lift and not walk more than 50 meters to get to my room. So there was all of these opportunities that I think we're often looking for revenue with the wrong audiences. Low season is one, but those really close to home audiences, 78 cents in every dollar spent by tourists in Australia is spent by domestic tourists. But our National Tourism Organisation has no overall responsibility for, they do at the moment, but normally speaking has no overall responsibility for that. There's no one body whose job it is to grow that domestic tourism pie, which would be your dispersal, which would be your out of season travel, which would be your travel to, places that, people who are coming and flying for 2 weeks, to use your example, Ged, would go. And it just blows my mind. It's a separate topic, but we're getting some great feedback. People saying they really enjoy the way the conversation is going. I do have to give a shout out to Jan Larson, who's told me that it would be even more difficult to ski in the Dolomites in June. Here's the thing, Jan, I wasn't actually trying to ski at that time of year. I just wanted to go and walk because we've had all this great content here in Australia telling me about how amazing Dolomites are in summer, but basically not if you got that. So
Caroline, I've got a question for you. I've got a question for you. You know that I always call you the what's his name, the guy out of Big Bang Theory, the genius. That's how I view you in tourism. So here's a question for you. No, this is just a logical way that I think. If we start to spread tourism over a 12-month period, which is what we should do, absolutely, and we begin to limit numbers over a particular period to ensure that the community is not negatively impacted, that the environment is not negatively impacted, if their cultural heritage assets are not negatively impacted, we've seen all over the world happening, then surely the value of that experience has to increase. Would you say?
Yes. Yeah, well, for some people, I mean, I think it's important to remember that human beings are social animals. So while, to Jed's point about the Acropolis, there are probably some people who were incredibly validated by that because they felt like they were doing the thing that everyone had to do. So I think, you may remember back to my presentation where I used the George Bernard Shaw quote about don't do unto others as you would have unto you. But yes, on average, we are going to, you are going to see that. And I do wonder, now, Nigel made this point about, how do we shift the language from small, less or minus to, unique, genuine and space. I think space to that point of view is going to be one of those measures that we could say, that we're getting an average number of tourists per X square meter or per hour of day square meter might be a really good thing, because as Jed said, you look at those pictures of Venice now and, you're looking at a Petri dish for COVID-19 until we get a vaccine. So we're not actually going to be able to do that. So yeah, I think a lot of those measures, objectively, our experience is there. But I have to say, I remember when I'd been to the Acropolis already, but when I went with my partner for the first time, we had the rough guide to Greece, and it virtually implied that the Acropolis was so busy that you shouldn't even bother to go. But the Acropolis is a great thing. So I think it's that challenge of where's that tension point of, most people do need to do or see the icons. I'm trying to imagine anyone who came back from Australia and said, no, I didn't see a single koala or kangaroo. Because a lot of what we say about the way we navigate is about what we display. So it's what does it make us feel inside versus what does it make us feel outside. And I think we need to tick those boxes, which is how good does it make me feel versus, what are the bragging rights? So I almost think we need a braggability index that's more than just I went to the most popular places. Because, we all heard that, things like social media would spread all of these things, that we'd suddenly see these other destinations, but we actually know it's the opposite, because we see this validation of those choices of going to Venice at peak season or going there. So maybe we all actually, in a week where Twitter has said we're going to fact check Donald Trump's tweets, maybe we actually need Instagram to be fact checking people's pictures where they've done that pose of the destination.
But also we need to fact check travel companies and what we're promoting. Yeah. Like I say, genuinely, the point that I was making there is,
yes.
We're showing them photographs taken during the low season, and we know that 80% of them are going during the peak season. That genuinely, what other business can you be that deceptive and get away with it for so long? We have got away with this for years. And I can't understand how nobody's picked us up on it. Frankly, it's ridiculous. Every single photo you see is taken during the low season. And the challenge I've got as low season traveler is the photos I want to use to promote the low seasons are the same bloody photos. But mine are actually taken in the low season and they're representative of what I'm trying to promote. The rest of them, every other travel company out there, they're selling stuff that is based on a lie. And like I said, so the original point was, why aren't they showing the photographs of the destinations as they are for the vast majority of people in those destinations? And the answer, of course, which everybody will have been shouting to the screen, is because no one would bloody go. And why would they? Because that experience is not what they were promised. It's horrendous. Yeah. Serious issue. I'd be asking for a bloody refund. Genuinely, if I was making a decision based on that, I'd be asking for a refund. I don't know how consumers haven't been up in arms about what we've done to them over the years in the travel industry. We should be ashamed. We should be utterly ashamed. I'm serious.
I agree with you. I agree.
It's awful. I know you're a very modest chap, Jed, so I'm actually going to ask this. Kruti has asked, can we share some more low season destination options? Antigua is a new one to me, so I'm going to give a shout out to Jed and what he's doing with Low Season Traveller, which is a podcast, and there's a website as well people can go to, isn't there, Jed?
Yeah, there is, absolutely. Thank you.
So you can, Kruti, if you'd like to go away and have a look, if you Google Low Season Traveller, you will find all of Ged's materials, and it's she's actually gone off. Kriti's actually gone off and had a look, so it's definitely there. So definitely there are lots of those destinations around there. I mean, I guess the other thing I wanted to pick up on what you were talking about, Ged, and I think it's something that we've heard all the way through this. To me, one of the surprising things was the extent to which this series was brought home to me that actually things weren't that great before.
Yeah.
Even in areas where we're used to thinking about, I think about John Grant's session on aviation, where he said, you know, we had the most historically profitable years. And I mentioned that 8 to 12% profit margin that he mentioned to an accountant friend of mine whose jaw literally dropped at the idea that that would be success. And this idea of, you know, well, what does recovery mean? And, you know, I kind of like that rebirth. So, you know, do we actually, you know, what should be the language that we're talking about here, and how do we manage this? Because you'll know my big fear is when we talk about this new normal stuff, that what that means is some people really want the old normal.
Yeah.
And just because we can doesn't mean we should. It's one of my travel research's favorite phrases. So, you know, how do we frame this, and what is it that we should be driving for, you think?
I think we need to understand first and foremost the nature of change. You know, change happens for the most part. The way in which we experience change is gradual. Coronavirus actually is one of the more notable examples where we had to adapt to change really quickly. But you know, you'll know, Carolyn, better than I, and I'm sure you could probably quote it far better than I could. You know, the curve of change. You know, where is it denial first, then anger, and all of these kind of stages that you get through before you get to acceptance. And you know, when coronavirus first came out, the travel industry were still talking about taking bookings, and I'm like, oh, this is classic denial. You know, you need to speed through this a lot quicker. But usually change is imposed on us in a more gradual fashion. So, you know, I've heard people saying on different bits that I've been reading in the media and even friends and family saying, you know, oh, I'm really scared. I think they're going to try and change us to a cashless society soon. I was like, dude, you know, we're way advanced on that. We're practically, that mission has almost practically been done at this stage. And actually coronavirus will just help that along. It's just that it just happens so gradually. That's because our, you know, tiny little minds, in my case, we can grasp it when it's just ever so gradual. Then we're not frightened by change. Generally speaking, as humans, we are not really good at adapting with change very quickly. We're frightened by change and we're threatened by change. But if it happens really gradually, then it almost happens without us knowing, then we can get on board with it a lot easier. So for me, I think, you know, when we talk about, you know, turning around this colossal cruise ship of an industry that we've got, it has to be really gradual, because if we try and accelerate that, then we will absolutely put people off, and that's just, I think, you know, human behavior that we've learned that. So it has to be gradual, and we have to just start to take, you know, I keep saying to all of my guys, baby steps, guys, baby steps, and it's a big picture. And I think that's what, you know, what I would ask everybody here to consider is, you know, it's a long-term plan that we're playing. It's a long game. You have to play the long game, and it's about small gains, small incremental gains towards the right direction, and gently steer and coerce this industry round. And that's what I'm trying to do with Low Season Traveler, and you know, that's what Chris is trying to do with WeTac, and I guess what you're trying to do with my travel research. I think that's what we're all trying to do, just gently coerce people around, and that's the only way to do it. I think short, sharp shocks won't work, and you know, that's evidence.
I think one thing that COVID-19 has done is it's given the industry a voice. You know, previously we've been dependent on the advice, if you will, from the leaders of our industry, whether that's UNWTO, ICAO, IATA, whoever they are, who the vast majority have been deafening in their silence during this period. Whereas the industry itself has corralled, has come together, has created communities, such as the one we've done here with this series of webinars. What's going to be interesting is when they come out with the rules that they deem to be the most applicable moving forward. And I'm sure there's going to be confusion. Sorry, something just came through on my phone then. There's going to be confusion because ICAO are going to want one thing, UNWTO are just going to punch up a bunch of numbers again. They'll have some recommendations, but again, I question the leadership right now. So how does the industry itself, looking at what we've achieved over the last few weeks since the onset of COVID-19, how do we bring this together to influence change? To influence, as we always say, positive change. Is it possible? Can it be done? Can we create a movement? Can we do something as an industry that would make the recommendations that leadership would possibly need to follow?
Well, it's interesting because that kind of links to a point Demetrius has raised as a question here, Chris, which is mistakes have taken place in the past and lack of proper leadership and planning. Is there a danger that for remote or low season destinations, if they fall into the wrong hands when they start selling, and it kind of gets to, so we have kind of over tourism in the low season as well. Who should and who is going to be protecting that new model of tourism, which I think kind of links to your question, Chris, which is how do we create those frameworks and leadership?
It's interesting, Carole, and you and I, either earlier this year or late last year, if you recall, we worked on a potential solution for this, where we looked at that whole of government approach, where we would have a series of matrix, a series of checks and balances, if you will, that would allow a destination to really gauge and really understand how they were tracking in terms of tourism. And that model that we discussed and we created is probably, if not right, it's pretty close to what destinations and what governments need to use. So the idea, and I think the mechanism or the structure for a mechanism exists. We know that because we've worked on that. It's getting the industry, it's getting the key decision makers to embrace that. Because what concerns me is that they're going to fall right back into the same trap. And what we're seeing with Greece right now is opening up to try and fill a summer season they thought was going to be barren. So they're going to jam pack as many people into Greece as they can to try and get some revenue, to try and quell the voices of the big boys who are kicking the government right now. And then at the end of that summer season, it'll go flat again, and then they'll try and redo it all over again. And this is destination after destination. I'm not just singling out Greece on that, but you can see what's basically going to happen. So how do we get that potential matrix up? I think that one way that we need to do is we need to bring in some of the larger organizations, some of the larger businesses that sit on the peripheral of tourism. What we've seen over time, certainly in recent time, is that the key influencers of our industry have actually been organizations that sit on the peripheral, not right at the heart of the industry. And if we can start to influence them, to put some dollars on the table, to allow the industry itself or some of the key thinkers within the industry to start to create the change that is required, that then will have to influence government. Otherwise, we could be on another slippery slope. And I think that would be devastating. This is a once in a lifetime, tourism lifetime opportunity we have. It'll be a shame to squander it.
I think as well, the existing guys are burdened by legacy. I'm trying desperately not to be critical of the big organisations that are out there, but I do feel quite critical of them, if I'm honest, because I feel at times that they've let us down. But they're burdened by legacy. They're doing the same thing that they've always done, and there needs to be a change. And you were saying, Chris, that a lot of these organisations and associations have been really quiet since this has come out, and I've noticed it too. And I think a lot of that is that they are burdened by legacy as to what they've always done, and they just don't know how to cope with it. And that's where, again, I think a really huge opportunity for this industry is actually it's new organizations, new startups. We were talking last week, Karen Priest did a great presentation and saying, that there's a lot of obviously a lot of jobs have been lost in the tourism industry, and there's a lot of people looking at leaving the tourism industry, and I think that's really sad, because actually I think there's a lot of opportunities within the global travel and tourism industry, and we need those bright minds actually in there. And the irony is for startups right now, people were saying to me, oh, you're a small startup, this must have decimated you. I'm saying this is the best time of my life, because as soon as coronavirus hit, all of a sudden, boom, I'm doing as many bookings as Expedia. They're doing nothing and neither am I. We're on a level playing field, genuinely. Awesome. How utterly awesome is that?
You're a glass half full person, Ged.
Yeah, no, but genuinely, we're both starting from the beginning. The only thing is, they've got a legacy of thousands, if not millions, of passengers that they've got to pay refunds out on and sort the bookings out for. They've got to lay people off and everything else. And I haven't got any of that to deal with. So actually, I can start to think creatively about solutions, about how we can get out of this mess. They can't because of their legacy. Now is an absolute golden time for people to get involved in the industry. It's a golden time for startups. Literally, there has never been a better time. We're starting from ground zero and we're building up. If you want to be involved, what better time to start than when everybody is absolutely on their arse?
Well, I agree with that, Ged. I think the other thing that I think we do need to do, I mean, Chris talked about organizations on the periphery, but one of the things that I think we should absolutely be doing is bringing more diverse voices into the conversations. So if I look around the world at all of the tourism recovery task forces, and I'd love somebody to send me an example of one that I don't know about that's doing something differently. Substantially, the people I'm seeing who are sitting on those are the same people who've sat on them for the last 20 years. And no, I don't want to decry experience. I sell my own services on the basis of experience, but I do wonder that how are we going to find new solutions if it's only the same people sat around the table? And absolutely, those people should be there. And one of the things I try and do when I'm doing consulting, I'm saying what we actually need is a mixture of the people who know where the bodies are buried, which is pretty much who we've got at the moment. But what we don't have is the people who will ask those, as you said, the questions like your daughter would ask, Ged, the 5-year-old questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do we do it that way? Should we do it that way? And I don't see, in spite of the fact there's an abundance of evidence that frontline staff come up with some of the best, most imaginative, most practically grounded solutions, I don't see many of this recovery forces or these think tanks actually going out and bringing in, frontline hospitality workers to say, how could we do things differently? On the other side, a plus example of this, we've had in Australia, a kudos to all parties. We've had the unions, we've had the employers, and we've had the government sit down together to try and work out solutions to things like how we can keep as many people in jobs as possible. And I think we need to be seeing more of that type of thinking within tourism, of what happens and how powerful is it when everyone is sat around the same table. And that was something that Tammy talked about in her session as well. How powerful is it when we're bringing in different ideas? I mean, I use that posh phrase in cognitive diversity, but cognitive diversity is just a kind of show-off way, my spotlight moment, of saying that, if you bring different voices in, you get different ideas. And that's one of the things I think we need to be looking at this and saying, well, who are the voices who've got really practical experience on this? If you're talking about how do we create a system where, we deal with some of the longer term issues. So a lot of this seems to be seen as, oh, well, we just need to cut costs. What about increasing productivity? I think productivity in tourism has hardly moved at all in terms of the way that we do things. Some areas we have, we can process people more quickly, but we're going to need to make step changes in, we talked about this with John Grant, we're going to need to make step changes in how we get people through airports. And, taking everyone's temperature, as he quite rightly pointed out, all I want to say is I'm never flying internationally from Sydney Airport again if we do that, because it's already, I have to queue to get in there. to fly because of the time zones and the way our flights work. You know, we're going to need to have people who work on the front line in security go, you know what, there's a really great way to change this. And there's a way that if you just shifted this, it would change things.
As I said, oh, sorry, I thought
no, go for it, Chris, because I can see there's another question coming through.
No, for me, what I was saying about working with companies who sit on the peripheral, we can learn an awful lot from other industries, and we've been very poor in the past about embracing some of the things that we could have learned from other industries, how they have coped with crisis or whatever. But I remember I ran an event in Auckland a few years ago, and on a particular panel discussion, I put 3 people together from 3 completely separate environments. One was a senior executive from Boeing in Seattle, one was a senior executive from Amadeus, and one was a mathematician who writes algorithms. And, Boeing spoke about their need to build 38,000 new aircraft over the next 20 years with 350 new pilots and 700,000 engineers, etc. Amadeus presented on a new report that they released, where they said in the future we will focus on the psychology of people, what drives people to travel. And they'd broken them down into 12 tribes, and they called them the 12 tribes. And then we had Dr. Matthew McDougall, who sat on the end, and he said, 12? You broke them into 12? And he said, yeah. He said, I do sentiment mining. He said, I break mine into 250,000 every morning. How are you going to cope with 12? And when you look at how other industries look at situations and scenarios to how we traditionally look at creating opportunity or whatever, it's vastly different. So I think we need, as an industry, to focus more on what other industries, environments, and businesses are doing that can potentially support the way we want to travel, the way we want to build this industry, and the way we want to think about the future. I found that a fascinating panel discussion. I've finished. There you go.
It's no war.
I think the last one was just a comment to follow up on your point about tourism ministers and saying maybe we actually need to have tourism ministers in a job for life. But I think probably what I think is a bigger challenge, because normally how we solve this, because that's not unique to tourism, you know, almost every job in government is a revolving door at some point. And some of that's for good reasons, like in a world where Putin is trying to give himself a job till 2036, I think turnover is actually sometimes a good thing. But historically, that role has been played by the public service. And I think one of the problems we have in tourism is we tend to move around ministries a lot. No one actually ever quite knows where to put us. So, you know, at one point in tourism in Australia, and Chris will remember this, we were part of the department of, we were quote, resources, energy and tourism. And, you know, there was a sort of logic to it because it's all a kind of about trade, but I'm kind of like, well, really? You know, so let's put it this way, the minister would have been responsible for the organisation that blew up that 46,000-year-old site of Indigenous art and the industry that would have taken people there for the next 100 years. So one of the challenges that sit behind that is that we don't have that permanent level of expertise in government always getting that opportunity to do that. We get shunted from department to department so that we don't have that necessarily a long-term group of people who are looking after us, who have that kind of institutional knowledge of how to make tourism work and ideas of it, in the way that if you look at an area like defence, for example, people are career defence public servants and they have great knowledge to bring to that. And there is innovation in that space. They're constantly looking at, you know, if you compare how much warfare has changed to how much tourism's changed, to take and expand Chris's point, you know, we're talking about a world where there may not be soldiers in battlefields. It may all be done by drones. In fact, it may all be done in cyberspace. we're still talking about whether virtual reality has a place in tourism.
The issue you've got with tourism ministers is traditionally the ministry itself, doesn't matter which country you're looking at, the ministry itself sits very low in the list of portfolios. So it's usually somewhere near the bottom. It was actually New Zealand, John Key, who recognised the contribution that tourism was making to New Zealand, which I think is now the biggest export, or it was. And he made himself, as Prime Minister, the tourism minister, to show and demonstrate the significance of what tourism is and what tourism brings to the economy of New Zealand. And that has been copied to some degree by other destinations around the world. But it still, for the majority, sits very low on the list of significant portfolios. And when you consider that probably 1 in 12 jobs around the world is related to tourism, it's insane that it should have that sort of position.
Yeah, I've got to say that just to usually it's Carolyns' point quite rightly to state there are some good tourism ministers out there. The tourism ministry for the Seychelles, Alain Saint-Ange, I thought he was always very good and did a good job. And it's quite. Do you disagree, Carolyn? You're laughing.
No, I'm just checking the questions while you're talking, Ged. And I've got one going. Ever wonder why tourism experts and biased like each of you maybe cannot be long-term advisors to ever-changing tourism ministers? I think we might have a bit of bias in the answer on that one. Sometimes we do get to, let's put it that way, may not be long-term, but sometimes we do get to do some of that stuff. Yeah. But I interrupted you, Ged. Please go on.
No. I was just saying that there are good examples of tourism ministers as well. I learned during the time at Roots when I was trying to get through to the ministers. It was just interesting because we wanted to get the ministers there because obviously they were the most, in my naive view, they were the most important people for tourism in each different country. And the couple of learnings that I had from that was one, as Chris was saying, that they're in and out sometimes in less than a year. Keeping an up-to-date database on tourism ministers is practically impossible because they change so frequently. And you've just built up a relationship with a tourism minister, and by and large, huge egos, as all ministers do have. And again, that's a problem with. That's something which needs to move. And not just ministers, by the way, but heads of our organisations. Can we just drop the big egos and I have to have a car waiting for me and somebody to open the door and all of this kind of, excuse my language, utter bullshit. This is like from a bygone days that frankly we're better than that now. But you used to have to placate these guys' egos to a ridiculous level, and by the time you'd sort of strive to build a relationship, stroke the ego enough, and then they're out of office and you've got another minister in where you have to start the process again. And what I realized actually is, more often than not, they have an under minister or a public servant who sits below them that is the advisor, and they remain in position all of the time. And what I learned was actually they're the ones that are actually the ones you want to influence, and they remain constant, and they do exist. But I have a huge problem with a lot of the egos of the upper echelons of the global travel and tourism industry over the years. I've been in this industry and I love it. I've been in it for nearly 30 years now, and a lot of it I see as jollies for the old boys club. I'm afraid it's not good. It's not something that we can be proud of, and I think again it's something that we need to change. And quite frankly, if not us, who? And that's what I keep coming down to all the time when we're talking about over tourism, when we're talking about how things want to change. If it's not going to be us who are in the industry, who've been working in the industry for 30 years and more, then who is going to be the one that's going to cause the change? So I think it's on all of us, frankly.
So there you have it. Thanks again for your company this week, and if you haven't already done so, please do have a listen to the keynote from this session, which you'll find in the previous episode, also out now. That's all for now. Enjoy your day, stay safe, stay healthy, stay home, and please don't forget to share our content with your friends and industry colleagues who may also believe that now, more than ever, travel is better without the crowds.